I'll tell you a bit about my story, so you can kind of understand how it is that someone would come to be a percussion soloist, because it is a bit of a, you know, like when you tell your parents, I'm going to go to the con and do percussion, that's one thing, but then to go on and graduate from the con and say, I'm actually going to do this for a living is another thing. And, you know, they're never that happy, but I remember my mum just said to me so many times, why can't you just get a job in the SSO like normal people, Claire? And I said, I don't know, I like doing my own thing, you know, it's just a different thing. So my beginnings as a musician was as a pianist. I started when I was 5, and it was something that I, you know, was always very passionate about, just playing music. But when I got to sort of early high school, I ran into that conundrum because wind bands and orchestras weren't so sort of prevalent in my day, where I didn't know what I was going to do in terms of playing with other people. You know, I felt a bit lonely being a pianist by myself. And so I came across this thing called Sydney School Symphonic Wind Ensemble, which is through the public school system, Performing Arts Unit. And I joined on percussion when I was in about year 6, and I'd auditioned on piano. And that was sort of my first foray into percussion, and I hadn't had any lessons, and I just started playing xylophone by myself, as probably many pianists have done in your own band, because there's obviously very obvious kind of similarities between the two instruments. And it was a kind of a strange beginning, because I wasn't really allowed to play snare drum or timpani, because that's what the boys played, and they sort of insist, and they were older than me too, a lot older, and they insisted on playing those instruments, and I just had to play mallet percussion. And I enjoyed it hugely, and we went to band championships and I loved it, but I never had any lessons. And so when I got to about year 11, year 12, I sort of thought, well, maybe I should have a couple of lessons. Would be nice to play a bit of marimba for my HSC as well as piano. So I had a few lessons with a really wonderful percussionist called Jess Champa, but I never studied properly. And so when I sort of did my audition for the con, I basically couldn't even do a snare drum roll. Like, I really couldn't play percussion in its entirety. I could play xylophone and marimba pretty well, but all the other stuff was a little bit lacking in terms of my experience. But somehow I got in, and at the con, I guess the wonderful thing is you have this access to instruments which you don't necessarily have at home. You know, I didn't really own any instruments, so I could practice my heart out. So I just focused very hard, I guess, on the things which were my weaknesses, such as playing the snare drum and snare drum rolls, which is still not necessarily my favourite thing about being a percussionist. I guess mallet percussion, because of my beginnings, is sort of my passion. And I'll talk more later about how that has sort of influenced my collaborations with composers and the way in which I brief them on, you know, what I would like out of a piece of music, as well as obviously what they would like to write for me, or what they would sort of find interesting. So just to talk a little bit about, do you want to hear the end of, so the end of the story, just very quickly. Well, it's not really the end. I mean, I'll take you up to now. Hopefully it'll keep going. Is that I did 4 years at the con, great, graduated, and I did this thing that anyone who knows a percussionist who studied at the con would know, which is that you graduate and then suddenly you don't have access to instruments anymore, and it's very difficult to practice because, well, you don't have anything to practice on. So, because I think by that stage I had bought a marimba, so at least I had a small marimba to practice on. But I just thought to myself, I need a goal, I need an aim, I need a next step. And so I decided that I would study overseas, so I was sort of applying to study overseas, do postgraduate. And at that time I also thought I'll do young performers because I want to have a goal, like a performance goal to aim for, because I'm very sort of goal oriented. And so I applied for young performers and applied to study in the Netherlands. I got a scholarship to study in the Netherlands, and that same year is the year that I did young performers, and I actually got into the finals, which sort of clashed with the time that I was meant to start studying. And they let me stay in Australia to do the grand finals with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and I ended up winning the first year that I did it. So that was, you know, it was a blessing in disguise, I guess. I think before I did Young Performers, I didn't really know specifically what I wanted to do with percussion. I knew I probably didn't want to join an orchestra. I knew I didn't want to start teaching privately too much, because then that would sort of take over my time and I wouldn't have time to practice anymore. And so in winning Young Performers, it just sort of gave me, I guess, this feeling of a trajectory, like, okay, this is something that I'm good at, this is something that I enjoy. For example, when I did the live performance of Young Performers, which was in 1999, probably you weren't even born then. In fact, I'm sure you weren't born, you students. And so it's a very long time ago now. It was on television, and so it was basically a live broadcast, and I didn't even get nervous. So that was a kind of a nice realization for me that this is something that I just felt very comfortable doing. I didn't get nervous, I didn't worry, I didn't feel anxious about it. I just loved making music on stage and really connecting with my audience. So when I went to Holland, it was interesting because, you know, Young Performers, you might not know about it now, but because it's just coming back again, it's been sort of put on the back burners for a few years. But it was a very big competition in Australia in its day, and will be again for sure. And so when I went to Holland, I sort of felt a little bit famous for about a week before I left for Holland, and then I went to Holland and everyone was kind of like, oh, we don't know what that is. You're going to have to prove yourself here. We don't care that you just won this big competition. And so that was a good sort of, you know, coming back down to earth, and I just practiced a lot, and similarly did a lot of competitions, and competitions that I won meant that I won money, which meant that I could buy my instruments. So it was sort of this great development for me of, yeah, I guess having goals, having successes, and finding my way as a percussion soloist, but also a chamber musician. You know, I really always enjoyed playing with other people, and that was something that I never wanted to let go of. So that's, I guess, sort of bringing you back to now. I was in Holland for 7 years. I came back to Australia because I just wanted to be back in Australia, and I sort of felt like through my experiences in Holland, working with composers and also collaborating with amazing musicians and throughout Europe more broadly, that I would really be able to give back to Australia in a more tangible way than I felt I could living in Europe, although it was a nice lifestyle touring around Europe and performing. And indeed, I do feel like that has been the case. I've been back here for 10 years now, and I lead my own group, Ensemble Offspring, and I'll talk more about Ensemble Offspring in a minute. But you know, it was great winning Young Performers because it meant that even though I was away for 7 years, I was able to come back to do performances with the orchestras, and yeah, it was a kind of a good opportunity to really keep my ties with Australia. So I have performed with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra before, and I very much look forward to performing with them later in the year. Just quickly, Linda asked me to kind of explain where I keep my instruments. I sort of touched on that earlier, basically everywhere. But because Ensemble Offspring, we don't have a home, I still keep the bulk of my instruments out the back of my mum's house, which is where I call the studio in Glebe, but it's really just a converted garage and it's quite small. So if you know of any opportunities, seriously, Sydney's a nightmare, being a percussionist, as Tycos and Synergy know very well. And I have my marimba at home, and then I'm just always sort of moving around gear. So I own a lot of instruments, pretty much everything that I would need to play other than timpani, but I don't tend to play timpani very often. So I own a 5-octave marimba, which is the very large version of this instrument here, a xylophone, vibraphone, glockenspiel, crotals, tubular bells I even own, but I'm selling them, so if you want to buy them, that's good, because I never really play them. And a whole heap of drums, a whole heap of ethnic instruments. So it's fun. It's very fun collecting all these sound sources that you might play, also found sounds, and I guess that's what keeps me going. The novelty aspect of, you know, really always finding new sounds, and I very much love that aspect of being a percussionist. I was also going to talk about my portfolio career, but I think I'm going to move on. I mean, you can work it out. I spend, you know, I'm an artistic director. I get paid 3 days a week for that. I spend you know, I guess about a third of my year or quarter of my year doing solo performances, the rest chamber music with Ensemble Offspring. I play with the Australia Ensemble. I was a guest soloist with the Australian String Quartet. So I just sort of, you know, I play in festivals, I tour overseas occasionally, but I have 2 children, so I try not to go overseas too often these days. So it's exciting. Every week's different, and I love that. And yeah, it didn't suit me to sit in an orchestra, which is not to say that it's not a brilliant job and career prospect for other people who want to do that, but that wasn't my thing. And you know, I guess one of the main reasons was because percussionists in an orchestra don't get to play all that often necessarily. You know, there's often like 66 bars to count until you ding a triangle, and then maybe you miss it because you lost concentration during the 66 bars. And that always used to stress me out a bit. I think I should have been a violinist or something, because I like playing. And I think that's why I've become a soloist, not because I like the limelight per se, it's just because I just like playing, and I like continuing to play, and I like making music and making phrases and playing with other people. So I think that's how it is that I've come to be, I guess, doing this unusual career that I have now. So enough talking for a moment. I thought I'd just play you a little piece. So I'll talk in a minute about the composer collaborations that I have, and we're going to be focusing on the work by James McMillan more in the second half after we have a break. But this is a piece by Matthew Hindson. Has anyone heard of Matthew Hindson? So he's a very well-known Australian composer who... sorry, I just have to see what sticks work. Okay. So he is an Australian composer who is the head of, well, he was the head of composition, but now he's head of music or something at the Sydney Conservatorium. And he is a long-time collaborator of mine. This was the first piece that we worked directly on. It's called Flash. It's actually on a CD of mine, which is also called Flash, which is just for marimba. And it has sort of half works by Australian composers written for me and half transcriptions of children's piano music. Anyway, so Matthew was the composer who actually wrote the piece for me with the Australian String Quartet as well, and he wrote that piece for vibraphone, so metallic, much warmer kind of sound world, I guess, and it was on the birth of his first child that he wrote that piece. So that's quite a special work. This work is very much like Matthew's kind of manic style, and it's called Flash. As I said, it is very flashy, and I do often sort of use it as an encore piece or end concerts with it. So here it is. So does anyone have any questions about that piece, or any insights or thoughts or anything? I think you'll see, as sort of I play more examples and talk more about my collaborations with composers, I guess, how that piece very clearly fits in quite well with the kind of concerto idiom, in the way in which composers tend to write for percussion as a concerto instrument. Obviously solo percussion can be quite different, but concertos are often quite showy and quite notey in the way that that piece was. So now I'd just like to quickly introduce you to Ensemble Offspring. So we are a group of, on average, 6 musicians, instrumentalists, so we're not a percussion ensemble. Flute, clarinet, violin, cello, piano, percussion is the core instrumentation, and we specialise in what we like to call innovative new music. It's hard to term this music that I specialise in, because in my world we call it contemporary music, but here at AIM, for example, contemporary music is pop music, so I can't, and I shouldn't really refer to it as contemporary music, but it's often known as contemporary classical music. I like to call it living music, and the reason why I like the terminology living music is I guess this idea that it's music of our time, it's music that's alive, it's music that is being made as it was in the days of Mozart and Beethoven, in collaboration with performer and composer, and it's happening in our lifetimes, and for me there's something very special about that process. It's often challenging because what I work a lot with composers is making their notation clear, making what they want to say musically clear on the page, right? Because in the most part what we do is play notated music, although we do also improvise. So it's hard because, you know, you're working with people, and every time you're working with a new composer, they have a different system, they have a different way of working, they have a different way of communicating, and it's, you know, I think that's also why I love it, because I do like being with and working with people, and I like this challenge of sort of getting the piece to the highest quality for the audience at the end of the process. So, for example, Ensemble Offspring, we have a concert on Sunday at the Opera House, in the Utzon Room, and at that concert we're actually doing the world premiere of a piece by Fiona Hill, and you know, so we're working with her right now on sort of really articulating through the score, making sure that what she's written down is really what she wants to come out in terms of the sound, because you would probably be surprised, you music students who also have to do composition, and maybe it's a passion for some of you, but maybe it's also something that is a bit tricky and a bit challenging sometimes, and you know, even professional composers find certain aspects of it very hard and very very challenging in terms of notation, just to get the sounds onto paper. And I'll give you some examples throughout the morning of how to notate for percussion, because that is something that I know a lot of music students especially find difficult, because also if you don't know any percussionists, it's very difficult for you to sort of know where to start. But firstly, in relation to Ensemble Offspring, before I play this little video, which is a showreel from our sort of 2016 series, we've also got this thing called Hatched Academy, which is, I guess, our sort of education outreach. So we have like an associate artist every year. We have a composer summer school, and we have this thing called Open Mic, which is an opportunity for young musicians to present sort of under the banner of Ensemble Offspring. We also, one of our biggest sort of recent additions to what we do is this thing called the Noisy Egg Creation Fund, which is basically just our philanthropic sort of program whereby we get private donors to donate to the creation of new works. And you know, it's with the recent cuts to the Australia Council, it's especially important that all of us, you know, you don't have to be rich. A lot of our donors are just everyday people who are passionate about new music and new sounds and what Ensemble Offspring does. And I haven't counted in the 6 years that we've been doing it, but I would say we've probably commissioned over 50 new works, which is a lot of music to be made that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And also it's a big job for me because as the artistic director I have to work closely with all of those composers with their questions, make sure they're staying in touch with us through their process so that we're always workshopping their ideas rather than them just sort of presenting to us their final product. And I think that's a really, really important process. And I guess what I hope to sort of get out of by the end of my life or by the end of my time as a performer and as an artistic director with Ensemble Offspring, I really hope that we and I will have really sort of added to the repertoire for percussion and also chamber music, because I think it's just so important. It's a very new instrument, percussion especially, and it's a very new idiom. And if people like me don't commission composers and work with composers and educate young and emerging composers, then we just won't have any culture going into the future. So I think I'm very passionate about that. And what I didn't mention is that in last year, 2017, we dedicated our whole year to female composers because I felt very strongly, and also my co-artistic director, Damien Ricketson, that it was time to sort of shine the spotlight on female composers. And so rather than doing what many other organisations do and just play a couple of works, we dedicated our whole season to female composers. We didn't play any male composers. And what that really did was show that, you know, the standard is just as great, and it gave opportunities for those female composers for us to perform their works when normally, you know, there isn't the space in our programming. So it's meant that my programming now into the future is probably 70% female, because that's what I am aware of now and kind of interested in. So we've garnered a lot of great feedback, I guess, on that commitment, and I still feel very convinced that it was the right thing to do for sort of the future of Australian music, but also international sort of living music, because it's not just an issue in Australia; it's an issue all over the world, and we got quite a lot of interest from abroad on the fact that we did that. So now I just thought I'd talk a little bit about... Does anyone have any questions, or...? No? We'll do questions afterwards, but if you do, or anything, like, I love it to be interactive, so if you have, like, oh, I just thought of this question, just stick up your hand. It's totally fine. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how it is that I work with composers, because, you know, I have touched on it, but there might be a few questions that you have around what does the process actually involve. So I work with a range of composers, so from composers who you probably have heard of, like Ross Edwards. He's written me a marimba solo called More Marimba Dancers, and I've played much of his chamber music also. Nigel Westlake, I'm about to play an arrangement of his work Compassion with Lior and the Tin Alley Quartet in Adelaide Festival. Also, Elena Kats-Chernin, she wrote me a concerto, which I'm going to talk a bit more about coming up. So, you know, all of the kind of big name Australian composers, I guess I've worked a lot with, which is enjoyable and different, I would say, to working with emerging composers, because those composers have often already worked out their voice. And what they're working on in collaboration with me is kind of making it, I guess, more like a good synergy with what I want out of the music and what my strengths are as a percussionist, maybe as virtuosic as I would like it, because I like playing hard things. So yeah, I'll talk a bit about Iain Grandage's concerto in a minute. But so when I work with emerging composers, so through Hatched Academy, but we work with, you know, a lot of younger composers, because I feel like it's really important to support younger composers in their journey, because if they don't have someone like myself or my ensemble to play their music, then they're not really going to get better at writing, are they? Because they hear their piece on Sibelius, and it sounds pretty awesome, but they don't ever get to work out if it's playable by an actual human being. And note to all the students in the room, everything that sounds good on Sibelius is usually about 20 clicks on the metronome too fast for a real human to be able to play. That's what I've worked out over the years. And things can sound really effective, played a bit slower by real people as well. They don't just sound kind of like second rate compared to Sibelius. So yeah, the work I do with younger composers is often, to be honest, it's really just giving them a platform for me to play their music and feedback, and often it's just a very gradual learning process for them. So over a period of, say, 10 years, by the time they get to the sort of 10th year of working with me in my ensemble over time, they will have gradually sort of honed their skills. But it's not something that, you don't work with a young composer and then expect that tomorrow they're just suddenly going to be an amazing composer who understands all elements of writing for all instruments. And then if you take that further to the orchestral realm, they get even less opportunity to write for orchestras. So that's, I guess, where I feel like my ensemble especially is a really good sort of middle entity between the computer programs and the orchestra, which maybe they're going to write for eventually, because they can learn how to write for instruments that are not en masse, of course. So when I'm working, I guess, with more established composers on concertos especially, and we're going to start talking about the medium of concerto now, what often I find is very helpful is if I know the composer quite well, and they know me, and then that way they know, I guess, my strengths and my weaknesses and what I want, but also I can be frank with them. And I've been, I guess, criticised in the past, especially when I was younger, because I'm very sort of direct and open and honest person, that I maybe made a few composers cry over the years, probably, being a bit too honest, because you know as a composer that it's a big deal to give your music over to performers, and you feel like you're being, opened up. And it's hard to be a creator, and it's hard to get that feedback and know how to take it on board. And I think over the years I've honed the way in which I give that feedback, for sure, but I'm still very honest, because I just feel, there's no point unless I'm honest with composers, and unless they can take away my feedback and try and integrate it into their music. So to speak a little bit more specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit before we have the break about Iain Grandage's percussion concerto that he wrote for me, and then Elena Kats-Chernin's percussion concerto, and I think they both feed quite well into talking about the Macmillan after the break. Has anyone happened to have seen or heard either of these concertos yet? No? Okay. So the Iain Grandage is it's actually a locked link on YouTube, but I could probably send you the link if anyone's interested, or the SSO could. I'm going to play you a little bit of the concerto now. Before we play a little bit, I guess I just wanted to talk about how that concerto came about. So it was a commission by the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and that's an orchestra who I have performed a lot with, and that was the first time that I'd actually had one of the big symphony orchestras commission a concerto for me as soloist, and it's quite, it's a big, expensive thing to line up, so I was very thankful to the MSO for supporting that. Iain Grandage, is he a composer that you've all heard of? Yeah. So he is a couple of years older than me, very young still, and he has written a lot for theatre. So his inspiration is very much often coming from kind of having a story, I guess. The great thing about Iain, when he wrote for me, is that we're very close. We're good friends. We used to play in a group together. We travelled Western Australia to the remote communities there together in a group with William Barton. And so when Iain sort of came to starting to write the piece, he said to me, "Oh, Claire, I've got this idea in mind. It's inspired by four stories of colonial women. How do you feel about that?" There's this one movement where Oh. Would you be able to get my handbag from the green room, please? Because it's got my phone in it, thanks. I just wanted to read you a little bit of the program note because I can never remember the order, but he said there's this one movement. It's the movement where this woman, she drowns herself and her child because she's really sad. And thank you. And would it be okay, do you think, if I joined you up to tubular bells and we made this structure and you would be joined to the tubular bells and you would lift them in and out of the water to change their pitch. And also at the same time it would be great if you could sort of act like a woman who's sort of drowning and really sad at the same time. So I was like, sure, Ian. I call him Iggy and he calls me Bear. So anyway, so Claire Bear. So I said, sure, Iggy, I can do that. I'll try anyway. I mean, I'll see what happens. So he drew this picture of how it would be, and he said, look, I've done a few sort of trials. I'm pretty sure we don't need anything to sort of stop to take the pressure off your arms. It should be fine if you just join something here, don't know how yet, and then you just pull really hard and then it should be able to like pick up the tubular bell over a thing. And then I tried it and I was just like, I don't think that's going to happen. For one thing, because we had this rope like twisted all around my arm and it was digging in, and then I literally had to kind of like pull so hard to get it out that felt like I was in the gym basically. And so I said, I think you need to go to an engineer and just design it. I didn't actually get organised enough to send the picture to these guys for the thing, but basically in the end we did use pulleys and to take the sort of pressure off. And then the other funny thing that happened was that I bought this top to wear for the concerto, and didn't know how we were going to join the ropes to my arms. And this, by the way, this is like 4 minutes of a 25-minute concerto. Like, there were other things that we needed to be worrying about, but the amount of discussion around this, like how we're going to do the lady drowning bit, was huge. And so the designer of this top, she actually made these sort of cuffs for me to put around my arms, which then had like a hook, which I had to hook the tubular bells, like the pulley system, into while I was playing. And in the premiere, when we were in Geelong, everything went fine. It was great. All the pulleys stayed on. Everything's great. And then when we did it in Melba Hall in Melbourne, it kept falling off all the time. And so I'd be in the middle of I'd hook myself up, and because I had to keep playing crotales, and then I'd look over and I'd oh God, it's come off again. And the guy who was the concert master at the time, he would keep looking at me, and he was kind of looking at me how can I help? I know you need help. Because we were in the middle of playing. But you'll see, I don't know if I took that bit out because it's in the long video where you can actually see all the hooks. They keep coming off, and I have to keep tying them on again. And in the end, it was fine. But you can imagine this is the lot of a percussionist. There's all these stressful logistical things that most other instruments don't have. So anyway. We'll play the first video in a sec, but first I just wanted to just say that so with the program note, the opening movement is around Barbara Bainton's book, Chosen Vessel. It's a concise masterwork, he says. And so that one is, she hears a passing horse and she mistakes it for a saviour because she's dreading the return of her swagman. And then he thinks she's a ghost, and so she falls victim to this swagman, and so then she dies. So that's a little bit sad as well. And then the second one is the conquering bush, and that's the story where she's unable to cope with the noise of the birds around her home, and so she chooses a drowning death for her and her child. So that's pretty heavy as well. That's the second movement. And these are all sort of colonial stories from the late 1800s. The third movement is from The Drover's Wife, the Henry Lawson novel, which you would know. And so in that one, the female character just dreams of a different life outside of the country where she's sort of stuck. And so she's staying awake all night in the bush hut, waiting for a snake to come. And then the final movement is a bit different because it's not based on a book per se. per se, but it's based on this tarantella. It's a tarantella inspired by this woman called Lola Montez, who was a famous sort of dancer in the 1850s, and she was famous for a spider dance. So the end is this very fast kind of tarantella, very rousing way to end. And I guess that's where Iain's strengths really lie. His great kind of in terms of the theatrical elements behind his music, and it really helps as a performer when you're trying to I guess embody the music on stage and work out what you want to say. And if you've got these stories in your mind as you're playing it, it does, for me, it really helps. So these are a couple of instruments that I often ask composers to use in concertos, because they're instruments that are sort of special to me, I guess. So this is an instrument called a waterphone, which is mostly used in an improvisatory way. So it's just these sort of metal prongs, and then this is a hollow metal kind of two dishes on top of each other with, I pour water on the inside, so you can hear there's water inside, and I bow it and it sounds kind of eerie. So Iain used it in that concerto, and the great thing about this instrument is that I can walk and play it. So it's a really good sort of vehicle from getting me from one side to the other of the stage, because if you can imagine, oh yeah, there's the instrument. So normally the conductor's here, right? And normally composers have one set up on this side and one set up on that side, because they want more than just one area or one sort of group of sound sources. And there's always that issue of how am I actually going to get, because I have to walk like around in front of the conductor, and then there are all these string players here, and then they have to sort of move. So it's quite funny when I have to walk with this, but it means that I'm not doing the mad dash kind of mid-concerto, which a lot of composers do, right, where you actually literally have to sort of run from one side to the other. So Elena Kats-Chernin also used the waterphone in her piece, and she used it to go from a setup on this side where I was playing a toy piano. So she's quite obsessed with toy pianos. She had one that we spray painted gold, because the concerto was called Gold and Kitsch, out the front, and then 3 out the back in the percussion section. So then I picked up the waterphone and I walked over. So this is something that it's not exactly a virtuosic instrument to play. It's quite easy, but it's sets a really interesting character and mood, and it's very nice to improvise on. So then there are this instrument, which you might be able to tell is sort of like cowbells. So they're called Armglocken or censeros, which are also in the Macmillan concerto. So they are actually the Swiss cowbells that hang around a cow's neck. So they're very sort of rough sounding. And what happens is the person there's a couple of makers in Europe who they collect these bells of certain sizes, and then they actually sort of drill holes in the side to make the pitch as specific as possible. So I have a chromatic set here from C. So you can hear some of them are more resonant than others, some are a bit sizzly, some are a little bit out of tune. And in a way that's the kind of nice thing about them, I think. So in Elena's concerto, she has me playing a lot of vibraphone, but also vibraphone and Armglocken together. Yeah, so it's spelled A-L-M. So I'll just play a little bit of this just so you can see physically how it works. So I worked a lot with Elena on this as well. If I was going to play the same thing on the vibraphone, it's much more compact. So it's much easier. Whereas this is quite, it sort of suits a concerto in a way because it's, it is quite, there's a lot of movement required to play that. So the other thing that Elena did, I just wanted to show you a little technique that I did with her, which was, where did I put those claves? Oh, there. This is a very sort of Elena thing that she uses a lot. There's one point in the concerto, which I think is on a recording, where I actually have to play these clusters. And it's just a really cute, all her music is like very sectional, so for that section it sort of really suits the fun nature. So I'll just play a little bit of the recording, which is a live recording from the Maya Music Bowl from last year, also with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And we might just skip to the next bit. So you can hear this is really sort of setting the scene. It's very sort of magical and mystical, which is very, very Elena Kats-Chernin, very sort of movie music in a way. And then I just had a little excerpt from the end. So with vibraphone. And I don't know if you can hear, this is the water phone, which I pick up and I play walking back over. So that's the very end of the piece. And then I actually end the piece and I tip over the toy piano and it makes this kind of crunching sound. We might just hold it because we don't have much time. So that was pretty exciting, playing that to an audience of, I don't know how, 15,000 or something, I don't know. There was just so many people in that place, it was amazing. And I love this idea that, you know, you can, in my role, I can bring new sounds to people who've probably never heard of percussion before, let alone seen a percussion concerto. Just wanted to quickly talk about this excerpt here. Oh, can you just put it back on that score? So this is just a section of the concerto. So you've heard already that composers often write very fast moving figures. So you can hear that's very sort of virtuosic, I guess. No, you don't need to clap, it's fine. And then going on to the next page, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so you've seen me play a lot of 2 mallets so far, but you would have noticed on the video, I think I was playing with 4 mallets a few times. So we have the possibility with percussion of playing with 2 or 4 mallets. And the great thing about 4 mallets is that I can play this section here, which is this kind of funky 5/8 bit. So there's a lot of possibility, I guess, with 4 mallets to be more expressive, but also obviously to play harmonies versus kind of virtuosic, chromatic or fast lines. So that's just a little bit on the Golden Kitsch, which is a piece that was originally written for myself and the Sydney Youth Orchestra, and I played it all around Australia with youth orchestras, with Darwin Symphony Orchestra, with heaps and heaps of orchestras. So that's been, I guess, probably the concerto that I've played the most in my career. But I just wanted to now introduce you to James McMillan, also known as Jimmy McMillan to his friends. So he's a Scottish composer who is not probably as well known in Australia as he should be, really. And his sort of rise as a composer, he's now, I think, in his 60s probably, but came pretty much with writing his first percussion concerto, which was called Veni Veni Emmanuel. And it used the theme of that plain chant as its sort of starting point. And Evelyn Glennie is a percussionist who is also Scottish, and he wrote it for her. And she's famous for not wearing shoes on stage because she feels the vibrations through the floor because she's deaf, or partly deaf. And you might have noticed in the Grandage, I don't know if you saw that I also wasn't wearing shoes, and that was not for any reason other than practically get around the stage without making any noise. But Iain, the composer, was very keen on me not to wear shoes in that particular performance. But that's not something I do all the time, like Evelyn Glennie. Anyway, the Veni Veni Emmanuel was a piece which I actually performed when I was living in Holland in a few competitions. And probably, you know, the first percussion concerto that I really was very enamoured with. I think it's got a lot of weight to it, and musical weight, which is something that a lot of percussion concertos I'm often a bit frustrated by, because they are, you know, concerto as a medium is just very showy, doesn't often sort of deal with deep musical issues or gestures. And Veni Veni Emmanuel, because I think it takes this plain chant as its starting point, and also James McMillan is a very pious man, so it's sort of very religious in a way, but I think if you're not religious, you can also take it on a spiritual level. It's amazing actually how many similarities there are between the first concerto, which I do know very well, and the second concerto. Funnily enough, I actually emailed Colin Curry, who's also a Scottish percussionist, who the second concerto was written for, because he's a friend of mine, and I said, do you have any insights for me for this presentation on the concerto? And funnily enough, you know, this particular concerto, the second concerto, doesn't have a real story behind it like the first one. It doesn't use quotes that he at least references in the program notes. So for me, I sort of see the second concerto as just purely a platform for the percussionists to show off their sort of huge array, their sound world. I actually had the pleasure of performing the first concerto with James McMillan conducting with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra probably about 10 years ago. So I feel like I know him quite well, and I know his sort of aesthetic as a composer, and I think that will stand me in good stead for this second concerto. In fact, the setup, so when I talk about setup, it's very, I guess, similar in a way to the other setups, where there's one on one side, one group of instruments on the other side. Often you'll have both mallet instruments on one side. So in this case, we have a marimba and a vibraphone. And on the other side, we have a sort of drum setup with sort of metal percussion sounds coupled with this drum setup. And interestingly enough, and annoyingly enough, this particular concerto has added an instrument which I have never seen, never played. No one in Australia owns one. We still don't know what we're going to do about that issue. And it's called the allophone. It's a funny thing. I think it's just metal, sort of upside down cups, and you play it like those crotales, like the brass discs that I said. And in this particular concerto, he uses the full range. I think it's 2 octaves of the allophone. So there's a lot of sort of this involved, because there's actually 3 layers of instruments. And I think what James McMillan has done in this instance is that he's used the setup, like this choice of setup, to sort of lead to the virtuosity on stage. So it's as far as I can tell so far, a very impressive piece. What Colin said in his response to me was that it's a great play for the soloist, and I can tell that from the score as well. I just wanted to say that you might have seen Colin Curry, I think it was the year before last, play Ross Edwards' double concerto with Amy Dixon, so he was the other soloist in that Ross Edwards piece as well. So The other difference between the first and the second concerto is that there's quite a big percussion section in the second concerto, whereas in the first there's just a big timpani part, which means that the percussion part, the solo part, as you could see in that video, is really being supported by the percussion section with quite a bit of doubling, which is a technique which Elena Kats-Chernin uses a lot in her concerto Golden Kitsch, where she also has quite a large percussion section up the back. The other instrument that is a bit different in this concerto is steel drums. So you've probably come across steel drums before in, I guess, more ethnic studies. Steel drums are not instruments that I've really had to play much before either. So that's another instrument that I'm going to have to sort of learn for the first time. And this is something that does, you know, I'm 42, I can't even remember. But it's often, you know, you would think, oh, I've played everything by now. Often there are instruments that I still haven't actually played, like the steel drums, and have to learn. And steel drums is different because of the way they're set up. As you probably are aware, that they don't sort of have a chromatic order per se. So that is going to be a challenge for me. And also sourcing the allophone is also going to be interesting because we really don't know where we're going to get that from. I have a feeling I'm going to have to buy it. What we can do sometimes with percussion, which is quite handy, is that so he was playing something quite soft and fluid on the vibraphone, so whatever the notes are, with these two sticks, and then he was playing the allophone with these harder. And so that way we can actually, I guess, have a bit more flexibility with the way we move between instruments, because what often happens in concertos, and you might have noticed this, is that composers often don't have you staying on one instrument for a particularly long amount of time. And so often you don't have time to change your sticks, because changing sticks requires putting them down and picking up another pair. So often what we might do is actually try and hold two different types of sticks simultaneously. So that's definitely a technique which happens reasonably regularly, especially concertos. In the first concerto, there's very distinct sections. For example, although it's one long movement, as is the case with the second concerto, there's a very obvious kind of very long marimba section in the first concerto, whereas this one is, for my feeling so far, a little bit more frenetic and a bit more frantic in terms of the way he moves between his material. Okay, so just talking a little bit about Macmillan's style of writing for percussion. Like I said, it's very notey. There's a lot of dashing kind of between various setups. And I think in his case, which is not always the case for composers of percussion concertos, I think the necessity to move a lot on stage is sort of a result of what he wants musically. So he never leaves very much time between sections, because he always wants to keep the drama kind of moving, and he never wants the audience to sort of stop. And likewise, the percussionist therefore can't stop. The other effect, I guess, that he does a lot is that, like I said before, he'll have the orchestra in the background playing really long flowing lines and these kind of like almost chorale-like lines, and then he'll have the percussionist just playing this sort of fast filigree material over the top of that, and that does occur a huge amount in this concerto as well. You'll notice that the program note really doesn't give anything away about the piece, which makes it hard to know really what he was thinking when he was writing it. Colin said about it, Jimmy wanted lots of metallic sounds in the piece, lots of bright and ecstatic resonance. The piece is celebratory, joyous. So this is why he built all these metals into the work. So it is very much quite a bright sound world because of all these metals. Because like I said, there's the percussion setup, the drum setup, but there's a lot of metal that he sort of pairs with the drums as well. Yeah, so in terms of what I wanted to present to you in relation to the concertos by James McMillan, I think that's about it. There's really good lists of instruments on the Boozy website if you want to check what's in the actual percussion solo part and in the actual orchestral lineup. And if anyone hears of an allophone arriving in Australia, let me know. Or if your school wants to buy one, that'd be even better. So maybe I thought it'd be nice to just go to questions if you have any. Yeah.
How often do you encounter graphic notation, and how would you notate the waterphone, for example?
Yeah, good question. With Ensemble Offspring especially, we encounter graphic notation quite a lot. I can sometimes be dubious of it because often it's just a way of saying to performers, improvise and listen. I think it can be really effective, and I think with the waterphone, yes, you do have to notate it more graphically than specifically. Often with the waterphone, I will say to the composers, don't notate anything per se, just tell me to improvise, because then straight away my ears are more open to sort of reacting to what I hear in the orchestral part. But if you wanted to just fill in the space to say improvise, you would just sort of write a bit of a squiggly line. If you wanted, what I can do on the waterphone is not just bow long notes, but I can actually articulate as well. So this might be a squiggly sort of line if you want me to go around it, or I can do single hits. And you would just write those without a clef, just sort of as random dots, I guess, in your score. So the great thing about parts that are more improvised or graphic is that you can actually have fun with your notation, and the main thing is just to make it very clear in the forward what your sort of symbols mean, and then it's very clear to the performer. And sometimes you can do really effective graphic notation using time-space notation. So you know what that is, when you have like a period of space on the score that maybe lasts for 10 seconds, and rather than using a time signature, you can just sort of place events, and that's how you can do chamber music that is maybe a bit more free and quasi-improvised, but keep the performers sort of relating to each other in relation to their events. And in that instance, I would highly recommend the performers playing off a score, because it's obviously very important to see what the other musicians are doing. And that's something that in Ensemble Offspring we talk about a lot. I personally always like to play off a score because I almost feel blind when I can't see what the other musicians are doing. But it's not always appropriate because page turns can be an issue. But it is very enlightening for performers to at least have a score to refer to, so they can write in cues. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I was just wondering, what sort of impact have new technologies such as instruments and sampling had on your composition and performance?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think maybe less so on me than some people from the younger generation. I think what I haven't really talked about today is am I a composer or not? And I don't know what you think from what you've heard me talk about, but actually I hadn't really composed much, and it's funny that the expectation on someone like me who's in the role of what I do is very much that I should want to compose, or that I should be able to compose. But the strange thing with me, so therefore I have actually been composing a bit more lately. I wrote the music for the video that was on the Maritime Museum for Vivid last year, but no one could hear it because I didn't have good speakers. But anyway, so you definitely wouldn't have heard that, but I was happy with it, in my studio. And I do a lot of sort of structured improvisations with colleagues. So Peter Knight, who's the artistic director of the Australian Art Orchestra, we did a collaboration last year called Acoustic Life of Sheds, where we did a duo in a shed near Burnie. And we made a new work that was sort of a 20-minute work where I played the waterphone actually, and I played fencing wire, which was strung up in the shed, and we used the shed to sort of resonate those wires, and we used a lot of electronics in that instance. And he used patches, which sort of, he sampled me in real time, and then I would play off what he what sort of came out of the speakers. And that was really fun, but I could only do that because that's what he specialises in, and that's not really my, like, I don't know well enough how to do all that stuff, and it's not, I guess I'm more of a sort of physical performer who's really interested in the physicality of percussion instruments. I'm personally not so much into technology. That said, it is something that we work with a lot, and for example our concert in the Opera House on Sunday with Ensemble Offspring, 2 of those works are with backing tracks, so but they're sort of triggered by us, so they're not like a backing track that just starts and then ends. They're sort of triggered at certain points in the piece, so we're triggering those off an iPad through this program called Go. And so it is something that we do work with a huge amount, and I think through the possibility of making what we call electroacoustic work, which is when you combine electronic sound sources with live acoustic sound that isn't necessarily being manipulated in real time, there's a very rich possibility to what the music can sort of be, and I think that's really wonderful. And there was another question over here, I think. Yeah, very often in my experience it is not notated clearly enough, and I think what composers often don't, it totally depends how they decide to trigger it. So in many cases it's a matter of it not being necessary to notate it, which in the situation of our concert on Sunday they have not notated the electroacoustic part, but we have gotten to know the score and we know cues, and we write in the cues of what are our cues. So that's one way of doing it, where you make it very obvious to the performers that there are certain cues in the audio part, and you might write those into the score, and that is your cue to go on to a certain section, for example. Or if it's a very busy part, you might actually notate it in a rhythmic sense. And where I find that composers very frustratingly fall down is that sometimes they'll just say one line, but there's this line that's actually louder that you can hear as the performer, and it's not written down at all, and it's extremely confusing because you can't actually hear the line that they wrote, and you can waste so much time because you just listen to it over and over again and you're trying to work out what your cue is, because all actually we need to know as the performer is what to listen out for in the tape part. So it's always best, if you can't notate the whole thing, to just write down the thing that is the most obvious, the thing, and again it comes back to being cues. And I think you don't have to write everything as long as you make it very clear in the forward that the whole part has not been notated. It's just the obvious cues which have actually been written down. So one score which I love, and it's a very worthwhile piece of music to study, I think, if you're interested in electroacoustic music, is Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's piece Contacta, which is a piece for piano and percussion, and it's one of the first pieces of music where a composer, it's from 1960 something I think, or 57, has written for 2 acoustic instruments plus a pre-composed tape part. And he's actually written the tape part as much as possible in its entirety. There are still bits missing, so as a performer you have to listen over and over again to know how to play with it. But it's very interesting work because I think it hasn't really dated too much in over 50 years sound world-wise, but also it's very interesting to sort of note how he notated both the percussion part and the electronic part in that piece. Yep.
Do you find time for yourself to travel and put yourself maybe back into the role of a student and learn from people particularly non-Western cultures, and just go?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and like everyone, I'm way too busy, and I think it is something I would like to do again. So my kids are now 7 and 9, and since they were babies, I guess that was something that I definitely had to put on hold because you can't do absolutely everything. During my time of living in Holland for 7 years, I did put myself out there in terms of learning new things and doing some African drumming and doing different styles of playing. But I guess because I was always so focused on the end game, which was to be the best exponent of the instruments that I have to play, I haven't done it as much as I would like, actually. And I think it is the next step for me. Like, for example, just say I love playing the steel drum in this concerto for the first time, and maybe I want to go to Jamaica and like study steel drums properly. I don't know. You know, really the sky's the limit with percussion. Like, I play this maracas solo, which you can see online as well. It's called Temescal, and I played it for a TED talk once, and it's with electronics as well. And that's another good example of a notated electronic part. But just for that, I had to learn how to play Mexican maracas and all the different sounds that you can get out of maracas. And maracas aren't instruments that, you know, we ever learn really in the in our undergraduate or postgraduate degree. So I would love to go to Mexico sometime and learn how they play the maracas. But, you know, then I could go to Africa and learn all the different styles of African drumming. Like, there's just, or I could go and learn like how to play congas properly. So it's a lifelong journey, I think. Yep.
What are you doing with Nigel Westlake and Percussion? What's that project?
So he rearranged the whole orchestral score, as I said, for piano, string quartet, percussion, double bass, and Leor's still singing. And so I was quite worked closely with him when he was rewriting it, because you can imagine, I think the original is for 4 percussionists, and he had to write it for 1. And even Nigel Westlake, who's written a huge amount for percussion, obviously, would send me like grabs of the score and say, "Is this possible, Claire?" And I was kind of like, well, I still am only one human being with 2 feet and 2 hands, and I don't think I can, you know. So it's a kind of obviously compromised version of the original, but I do think he has pretty much kept it intact, and so it's a more up close and personal experience, I guess, than the orchestral one. And we're playing it in the Adelaide Town Hall, and also in Eucharia, which is like a great venue in the Adelaide Hills. And we're playing it also later this year at Port Fairy Spring Festival, which is a festival that Iain Grandage, the composer from before, actually is the director of. Yeah. Thank you.